Well, thank you for joining me tonight. So this is FrogWatch Lite. So it's an introduction to frog and toad conservation in the St. Louis area. So we are going to jump right in here and get a little more information about our frogs and toads and what's happening here. So who am I? So I'm Mike Dawson. I am the chapter coordinator of FrogWatch here, and I've been running this chapter for about close to 8 to 10 years, somewhere in there. The reason we have a chapter here, and I run a lot of different projects, is, well, I wanted to join FrogWatch like a lot of people. And so I went on the internet and I heard the term FrogWatch and I Googled it and it said, well, contact your nearest zoo. And so I did. And of course, we didn't have a FrogWatch chapter, so my boss asked me to create one. And so since then, I've been running our chapter here. I'm also a conservation education liaison for the St. Louis Zoo, and I end up doing a lot of different frog projects and survey projects. And so that's just my area of interest. I love frogs. So when I'm not doing something like this or I'm not working at the zoo, I am out in waders looking for frogs. So I thought I'd start with this, and you can answer in the if you'd like to in the Q&A or the chat. Hopefully you should be able to hear the calls. Does anybody recognize any of these frog calls? So I'll go ahead and stop that there. So those calls are pretty common around here. Sometimes you don't hear a lot of them in the city in the very background, and we're going to go over some of those cool calls. There was some leopard frogs. These are some of our early breeding species here that come out right now, actually. So the end of February into March, these guys are out. There are peepers calling. There's all kinds of them, and we're starting to lose a lot of these species. And so what I wanted to start with is kind of like what's going on with our frogs and toads. So if you're not familiar, I thought I would go over a little bit about what's happening. So in the world, there is an amphibian decline, a worldwide amphibian decline all over the place, usually mostly in the tropics, which is where you find most diversity. And a lot of it is tied typically to a fungal disease that has spread worldwide starting in the late 90s. And it's making its way around the world, unfortunately. And it's hit some areas pretty hard. Asia is being hit pretty hard right now. In our country, it might have been here probably since the 60s. And a lot of animals already have immunity to some form of it. It's called chytrid, and it's just a fungal growth. And what it does is it actually breaks down the keratin in their skin. And so a lot of them end up with bacteria infections, or if they get a really nasty fungal infection, it can actually smother them and have trouble breathing. But most of our frogs right now, they're still declining, and there's pockets where it gets hit really bad, especially out west. But our area in the Midwest, most of our guys are, dealing with it. Now, the problem is when you have a fungal infection you're fighting your whole life and there's pollution, other things can happen. So if you were to look at our area, this just gives you an idea. These are actually observations from people who have become volunteers in our FrogWatch program, or people who are participating in FrogWatch Lite, and we're going to go over how to collect data. There's lots of different frog species. There's about 10 common ones around here. These just represent, just give you an idea. Here's the city of St. Louis, and that little pink line in there, that's Interstate 270. It kind of gives you an idea that there's definitely some places to look for frogs and toads. But what we notice is kind of like looking at, like picking different frogs and toads and starting to look around. There is a pattern we noticed, and one of them is from all our volunteer data. Certain species, especially our spring breeding species, the ones you just heard, these guys are disappearing, unfortunately. So the ones that we're most interested in right now are the spring peeper, cricket frog, and chorus frog, and they're all actually in the tree frog family. And if you look at them, they kind of look like a tree frog. They don't climb trees as well as a tree frog. But these guys are definitely very sensitive to some changes that are happening, especially in the core of the city. And as you start to head it past that 270 line, you still find them. But there's pockets where they're still starting to disappear in new subdivision areas and things like that. And so we're trying to monitor these guys. So if you take a look, one of the projects that this data supports in some of the different ones, especially our FrogWatch Lite project and our normal FrogWatch project, gives you an idea. These are some different municipalities, give you an idea, but this is only where we're finding those frogs now. You can see they're absent for the most part in that 270 thing. And we've done a mix of using volunteer data, from taking recordings on telephones to putting recording devices in trees and parks. And this is kind of what we're finding. In some places, we just haven't gotten there. And so we're still trying to fill that map in. But this gives you an idea, whether it's a creek or a river or a pond or something like that. We definitely want to know where these frogs and toads are. And this is what we're working on at the zoo. So why are these being affected so much? Well, the best way to look at it is they're just very sensitive to changes in the environment. And it's because of their life. If you think of their life stages, is they start in water typically as an egg, they hatch as a tadpole, they grow as a tadpole and into an adult, but they're back in the water. And so their entire life cycle comes in contact with lots of different things, whether it be pollution, or other types of things that can affect these guys. And temperature changes can also have an effect on them. Urbanization, altering their habitats, because maybe people put certain fish in their areas, and some of these guys do okay with fish and some do not. And so we're noticing that a lot of them are starting to disappear. And our watersheds have been developed and altered, of course, for a lot of our urban use. And if you grew up in St. Louis, and you might have seen some of the areas that might be more wild, like I talked to a gentleman several years ago about Coldwater Creek. I think he was in his 90s, and he used to trap in Coldwater Creek, and there used to be otters and minks and all kinds of stuff, and now that doesn't exist. And so a lot of our creeks and rivers have been straightened or channelized and changed. And so over time, it's altered, what the natural habitat used to be. It doesn't mean we don't have these animals here or they can't come back, but it definitely means we need to take a look at them, because a lot of those areas where they do disappear are tied to things where might affect humans, whether it's pollution in the water or not. And if you look at our watersheds, a lot of runoff sometimes can get in those things. And fishing areas are important, but that is a thing that can affect some of these guys. Retention ponds, unfortunately, for some animals, it can be a bioaccumulation of chemicals and things like that. And so we are finding that in some places it's not working to have these nice retention ponds. It works for some species, especially birds that can fly and move around, but in some areas it's not. This picture on the right here is actually a retention pond behind Webster University, their parking garage. And I actually, not intentionally, but I was recording a toad calling in the background. Several years later, when I was analyzing the recording, there's one male spring peeper calling all by himself. And I'm pretty sure today there aren't any peepers in Webster Grove anymore, but there definitely were. And I have a recording of one. The other reason why frogs are important to humans, at least, is, well, they're great for the natural world. They eat a lot of insects. They're fantastic for eating insects. If you think of all the different sizes of them, if you have a nice diversity of frogs, well, they eat everything from mosquito larvae up to large predaceous insects. And so they're great to have around. Some of them are being studied for medicine. And now we don't particularly use any of the ones in our area in the Midwest, but poison dart frogs, they've actually extracted some of the chemicals, and they use them in all kinds of medicines that might slow the heart down or things like that, even during heart surgery. So they're very useful. A lot of the neat chemicals on their bodies can be used by humans. So I thought I'd also jump in and do some quick frog and toad basics. And then we'll stop before we start learning some frog calls here, and then how to collect some frog calls. So just so we're all on the same page, so frogs and toads, they are pretty squishy because I'm outside catching lots of them, but they are vertebrate animals, which means they have that backbone and a spinal cord. Now it's not a lot of spinal cords, but they definitely have a backbone. Tiny little thin bone arms and everything, and they do have teeth actually in their mouth. Now most of them don't have a lot of teeth, usually just upper row of teeth, but it aids in grabbing and holding on for their food. They do belong to the group amphibians, of course, and so that does include salamanders and caecilians. We do not have caecilians here, but if you were to go to the tropical areas, it's another amphibian group that kind of looks like a worm. But if you can imagine, if you took a worm, made it really thick as your arm, and you put bones and teeth in it, you'd have a caecilian. Kind of unique animals. And you don't see them very often at zoos as well either. They don't make very good displays because they live in dirt, basically. They live underground. And we used to have some at the zoo about 10 years ago, but it was a big tank of dirt. So it wasn't very popular. So if you were to look at them, here's a good example of that skeleton there. They do, of course, have a lot of neat things I'll point out here, but obviously they have great eyesight, and then it makes them, hard to get close to take photos here. They do have good hearing, and they do have that neat slimy skin. And if you look at the digits, a lot of them either have webbed feet, might have toe pads if you have to be a tree frog, a lot of variation in skin color and toes. They typically lay eggs in the water. And so this is just a good example. A lot of times they look like these pictures. These are actually frog legs on the left and some toads on the right. Gets a little covered in mud. It looks like weird noodles. And I have some other photos here, but this is typically what they look like. And all the ones in the Midwest are going to lay their eggs in water. If you go to different places in the world, there are a few frog species that do a few different things, but in our area, they all lay eggs in water. And of course, they go through that metamorphosis. All young develop that way, especially in the Midwest. All of our frog species do that. So they're going to lay an egg, and when they lay an egg, it does depend on time of year, which is why you don't see them all at the same time. You don't hear them all at the same time. They do have a life cycle that is dependent on, of course, rains and different time of photo periods. So some of them are going to be active now, and some are not really that active until later in the spring, and some are not even active till the summertime. So it depends on where you are and what kind of habitat as to how long. The metamorphosis for some of our frogs and toads is also different. So some might choose a pond that dries up by the summertime, especially if you're like a small spring peeper and your eggs get eaten really easily by fish. Well, you want to pick a little ditch or something like that that's dried up, because once you're metamorphosized, you come out of the water. It's not a big deal, and there's no fish in it. And so those animals might metamorphosize within 2 months. Then you have something like a big bullfrog, that they can lay their eggs in ponds with fish, don't have a problem. And they take usually 2 years to metamorphosize. So if you find a big fat tadpole right now, it's probably from last year. And then this year, they're going to eventually get their legs and finish metamorphosizing. They also go through what's their mating behavior. A lot of times they call it implexus. And so typically the goal is for the male to get as close to a female as possible and fertilize their eggs as they come out. These are actually two toads I took a photo of. And the guy in the back, that's the male. And you can see that the size difference. And usually the females are a lot larger than the males. But usually it's a wrestling match, and whoever can either one. We'll talk about calling, but to attract a female. But once they get close, is to grab on and hold on. Which is why a lot of times if you ever pick a toad up, and it's a male and you grab them around the back, they'll make a release noise that says, "Hey, I'm a boy, get off." Because a lot of these guys, if a toad comes near, they're going to jump on and try to fertilize eggs. And so they're usually pushing around and fighting to get close to the female. If you look at the skin, some differences between kind of toads and frogs, and there's lots of different, they're both, amphibians, but toads usually have a little bit drier skin. They've adapted for living more on land, and so the skin's thicker. And so those bumps, a lot of people, you hear the word warts. You can call it warty skin, but it's not the same as a human wart. You can't get anything from these guys. But they do have that neat skin, so they don't dry out as fast. Where if you look on the left over here, these guys have glandular skin, and water evaporates quite quickly, but it allows also for mucus to come out a little easier. The other difference is, if you look, and this is a great comparison, on the left there's a nice frog eggs, and on the right there's some toad eggs. One's more of a string, and it's just an adaptation. A lot of times the toads will pick places, maybe the current's moving a little bit, and they can kind of wrap it around like a little string. Usually, like frogs, typically like to pick a pond. There's not a lot of movement of water, and they'll lay their eggs in big masses. The other difference between a toad and a frog, I don't know if you can see the picture, but the one on the left is a frog, and it has little ridges or teeth, protrusions. And toads actually have no teeth, which is a true toad anyhow has no teeth. There are a lot of frog species that have evolved to look kind of like a toad, but they're not actually a toad, or at least they don't belong to the same family group. The last thing about frogs and toads, makes them a little bit different, is all frogs and toads produce different chemicals that come out of their body. And sometimes they're antifungal, antibacterial, something that are a lubricant like a slime. But most of them also produce something that's either a toxin to some degree. It doesn't taste good. And a lot of times it varies. And most frogs, you get, slime on your hands and you forgot to wash your hands, nothing happens. I mean, you probably want to wash your hands because of bacteria, but the chemicals aren't going to do anything. But some of them are pretty nasty. Toads store all their toxins typically in the two big bumps behind their head, called parotid glands. And there's little tiny holes. And when they get nervous or upset, or somebody's biting them, like a dog biting them, they'll excrete. And it looks kind of like a tree sap. And if it gets on your lips, or it burns. And it's pretty nasty. Usually makes most animals gag, which is what they're hoping, and they spit them out. When I was young, I had a basset hound, and my basset hound ate a toad. Laid around all day, had gas all day, and then threw up a toad. And I thought, well, I guess my dog learned, but my dog as a child ate 3 more toads, never did learn not to put toads in their mouth. So when you think about frogs and toads, they do create obviously lots of different noises, but the one that's most important for identification typically is the advertisement or breeding call. And this is the one that most people are familiar with. The noises you hear most often are these, but they do make other weird noises. They make aggressive noises and usually called agnostic. They're fighting over a branch or something or a territory area. They make alarm calls, and you probably have heard the alarm call. It's when you walk up to a pond and you hear, and they'll jump into the water. It's not universal, but pretty close. You can actually record that frog call when you hear that little noise and play it really loud. A lot of them will just start jumping in the water. It's something that's usually pretty similar among all the species. So they do make these other calls, but we're going to focus tonight a little bit on several different species that are common in their advertisement or breeding call. So species recognition, how they know what they're hearing and everything. They do have a tympanum, so that's their ear actually. What's cool about a lot of the big frogs is if it's a super big ear, like bigger than their eyeball, it's usually a male. And this is how, number one, they recognize what species they are. They have an ear canal and bones in there, just like you guys, but they have a covering that protects their ear canal. But that membrane does vibrate. Now, to produce sounds, they actually have some really unique vocal sacs. And so there's a couple different styles, if you want to think about it that way, or adaptations. So if you start on the left here, you have internal, and it's basically like some guy ate a balloon, basically. The sacs so deep down on their throat that when they vocalize, their entire body moves. And then you have paired external sacs, which is actually my favorite. So this would be like a leopard frog. If you imagine two balloons on left and right, and a lot of times when one deflates, the other inflates. So it's like back and forth. And then you have the single one. And you probably most tropical frogs I always see like a rainforest typically have the single external sac under their throat. And they blow the air of their vocal cords. And they can make everything from clicking noises to trills like a toad, all kinds of interesting noises. So when's the best time to listen for frogs and toads? Well, the best time to listen for frogs and toads typically, obviously, is the evening time. That's when they're more active. You can hear them during the daytime. Matter of fact, I heard chorus frogs today. I was out at Riverlands, so up near Alton. The chorus frogs are out and the peepers are out. They're just more active in kind of like the evening and into the night is when they're more active. Typically, usually start slowing down about 1 to 2 in the morning. But that's that window. So if you were to get near evening time, the sun goes down, it usually triggers them, just like crickets and things, to start calling louder. But if it's a rainy or overcast day, they'll definitely call. So before I move on, I'll check real quick and see if there's any questions here. Okay, here we go. And we have something here. Let's see. Nope. Okay, no questions. Okay. I will keep moving along here. All right, I'm going to make this box disappear. Okay. There we go. So we're going to start with probably the most common one. Whether or not if you've heard it, a lot of people know this noise. They just don't always know what it is. But if you take a look here, I'm going to play this. This one is like it's called a trill. It's a soft noise. Now, depending on how fat they are, the sound's about the same, but it might be a little higher pitch if you're a thicker male toad or a thinner one. And that's actually how the selection process works for females, or if you're unhealthy or something like that. They're listening for a certain frequency, a certain volume for the call. And that's how they judge, I guess, whether or not you're a good, healthy male partner. But that's the noise they typically make. One of the ways you can tell sometimes if you spend enough time listening to them, and that is not a cricket or something like that, is they have to take a breath because they're vertebrates. But if you listen to that noise, they'll call and then they stop and then they start again. Where if you're a cricket, you just taper off because you're rubbing body part against the wing and the leg. But if you take a look in here, they typically come out a little bit later. So toads have not started calling yet, although once in a while you get one guy calling, but usually it's March, April, and May is the time that they're most active. And usually right in the middle in April is the boom of their chorusing. And so instead of just one, you probably have 100 of them all calling around a pond. But that gives you kind of an idea. And it goes up and down. So as the season starts, get a couple calling, kind of like going to a party, and then pretty soon, boom, you get a whole bunch of them, and then it winds down. Then bad wine goes back up again, and then eventually they start petering out, and there's like one guy calling and won't go home. So these are the other ones, and obviously there were some of our target species, but they're ones that we're definitely interested in. So here's the spring peeper, and these guys, if you get really close or you have lots of them, they are so loud that they can actually cause hearing damage. So that's a bunch of them calling. It's pretty close to a chorus, although usually a chorus you can't even tell individual ones, but it's more of a preep, 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 preep. And this one is already calling now. So they come out in February typically, and I'm going to stop that because that's killing me. But this is an early species, and sometimes I have seen ice, near the surface, and they come out, and they do have antifreeze properties, especially these early breeding ones. This one is the one I do think is a little more sensitive. I always thought it was a spring peeper, but I think chorus frogs are in our area. They're getting harder and harder to find, so they may be more sensitive to changes in pollution. To me, they sound like a rain stick turning upside down, but they make what people usually refer to as a pre, or running your finger over a comb. But pretty distinctive. Sometimes, though, you have to get closer to hear it. They do have that great eyesight, so it does make it hard. You get too close and they quit calling. But right now, both these species are currently around the city. If you go farther out in some of the different parks, you can hear both these species calling right now. And definitely tonight they're calling. Great tree frog, most people have always heard this one. And so the great tree frog is a really common one, no matter where you live in the city, because they do like people. The reason why is we build buildings. Tree frog is adapted to finding places to echo their noise, and they do eventually breed down to a pond. But typically in April is when they come out, and what you'll hear them up in the trees, then down halfway down the tree, and then on the ground somewhere, heading towards a pond. But they do climb up on objects a lot of times that will echo, whether it be a big tree or a building or a rock face, and that's why they don't have an issue living around people. They don't need to live in the water; they just need to breed real quickly and then leave. But pretty distinctive sound. You can hear this one. There's two, one calling back to it. And a lot of times it is a natural response for these guys. When they hear another male call, they'll call back, and it's like a contest. And then cricket frog is, I think, pretty memorable because it sounds like two marbles. It doesn't sound like a cricket, but they hop like a cricket. But their call sounds like two rocks hitting together, two marbles. And this is also typically it comes out in April time period, but they go all the way into the summertime. I find cricket frog are usually more often in creeks too, as once they're done breeding in a pond, they usually end up in a creek. Leopard frog, and this is a good picture my wife and I took. If you take a look, pretty distinctive. It's in the group with bullfrogs and stuff like that. If you look behind its eye, this weird line is actually a fold of skin. It's called a lateral line. And several species have that, and it does help because there's some species like a bullfrog does not have a very long lateral line, whereas the leopard frog and green frog do. And so it's one way to kind of tell them apart. The different spots and things like that can help you between some of the different frogs, but this is a good example of one of our southern leopard frogs. I think they sound like people laughing a little bit. And in that recording, I don't know if you could tell in the background, but there were spring peepers in the background and a toad calling. It's hard sometimes to get really clean calls, but that's in the front you're hearing right now. That loud noise is that leopard frog calling. And if you look here, it's one of the few big frogs that starts to come out in February. So this is one of the earliest large frogs that come out. And then we'll end up with these last two big guys. These are the ones that your summer frogs. So if you happen to live around a big pond, this is probably the most common. If you have fish in your pond, these are the only frogs typically that are going to survive. Sometimes leopard frogs, but these guys have no issues usually with fish in their ponds, and their tadpoles don't taste very good. Might be why. But if you take a look over here on the right, there's that lateral line on the bullfrog wraps around his head, but it doesn't go all the way down the body. The green frog over here, you can see like the leopard frog has got that long line, and sometimes there's some breaks in it. I don't particularly like the call of the green frog, but I'll go ahead and play it. It's kind of like a band, sometimes a banjo-y string noise, and sometimes like a twang, but sometimes a garbly noise to me. That's that one. And the bullfrog has that nice deep, the phrase they like to use is jagorum, but I'll go ahead and play it. And you can hear in the background, there's some cricket frogs calling, actually. I think. Nope, chorus frogs calling, I think. But it has a pretty distinctive noise. But typically in one pond, you only have one or two because these guys are pretty territorial. But those are most of the frogs that you're most common around here to hear. And so I wanted to make sure you heard some that are later in the season. But typically when you hear these, it does take practice to learn these and go over and over. And I'll give you some good resources and places to go to practice frog calls. But it builds upon each other. And so I usually listen to one for a while and then practice that. But usually it's something like this, unfortunately, when you're outside, it's really loud. So that give you at least an idea of sometimes that is how loud it is sometimes out loud at nighttime. So I thought we'd do something here. I don't know if this is going to play or not. There it is down here. See if you can guess how many species of frogs. So how many different types of frogs do you hear? Not necessarily individuals, but oops, well, that gave it away. Okay, I don't think it's a big. Anybody know what frog that is by the picture or the noise? Let's see if anybody got it. Let's see. You're welcome to throw it in the chat if you know which one it is. So of course, so it's a cricket frog. So that one is a cricket frog, two marbles sitting together, is the way that I remember it. Let's try another one here. Whoop. Oh, now it's gone. So in this one, if you look, how many different species of frogs and or toads do you hear calling? So this will be a number. So I definitely hear more than one kind calling. All right, so we got some answers here. So we have 3 calling. All right, so we have a number here. So somebody believes it's 3 calling. Let's take a look what it was. Whoop. Oh, well, now we're going to see if you can name those species. There we go. So it was the American toad and cricket frog and spring peeper, and that's what was calling all together. And a lot of times it is nice when you start learning them because a lot of them call together. And so if you're not sure with one, a lot of times if it's spring, there's, process elimination. It's going to be one of the 3 that come out. Now, how can we help with frog and toad conservation? And so the reason why we call this FrogWatch Lite is this is not the FrogWatch volunteer training, which I'm offering, I think, virtually and in person this year. But this is another way that it doesn't take a lot of commitment to help, but this is how you can help. So if you happen to have a smartphone, and if you've never heard of it, and I'll go over it tonight, there's an app called iNaturalist app. And it opens on your telephone and it records pictures and audio. And so you can record like animals making calls, and it could be birds, but it can be anything, but it creates an observation and it collects information if it's allowed on your phone. The GPS coordinates are tied to the sound. And it also has some really cool built-in AI software that usually can help you identify or get close to it. And then it also uses the online community and there's millions of people actually on this platform that jump on and help people identify it. And so it uses crowdsourcing. So it uses a lot of different sources to help identify whether it be a picture or an audio. So you don't have to know that much about animals. You can just take a photo and it can help you either use the software to identify it or use crowdsourcing. And so I thought I'd go a little bit through iNaturalist in case you've never heard of it before or knew how to use it. But it's pretty simple. So to join, I typically make an account on a computer, not on my telephone, although then you can download the app on your telephone and log in after you've already had set up your account. But typically it doesn't take much. You just need an email address. A lot of these, I think you can set it up even just using your Google account. But once you get an account and create one, typically you can download it on the telephone and you can upload stuff in multiple ways. So If you wanted to and you record it in a different way, you can upload it from your computer. But using your cell phone makes it the most easiest. But what it looks like in here is like a lot of the platforms, whether it be Facebook or something like that, it has a little row of pull down menus across the top. And sometimes you got going horizontal as well. But it makes it a lot easier to be able to put data on here. You can look at your observations. You can look at the billions of observations that are out there. It's a pretty unique platform, and you can keep your own running list of things that you've seen, which is kind of neat. So I think it's a very unique and a very useful platform. And I'll go jump to the next slide. So if you were to look at add your own, there's a couple of places, like I mentioned before, but you click on add your observation, and this is what pops up. So first, this is the information that you need to put in. So using a smartphone or something like that, or you can upload something from a computer. Number one, who you are. So it pulls your account up, where you saw it. You can manipulate and put it in a different place if for some reason it didn't record correctly. It's going to know the date that you saw it and what you saw. So you have to put an observation in there. You put your guess what you think it is. And then what evidence, and that would include either a picture or an audio for an observation. But here's a good example in here. So I uploaded a photo from my garden here, and there's a little frog on a milkweed leaf. The picture itself automatically looked at it and brought up that it was some kind of tree frog. And it pulls up the 10 most things related based by the pixels. And you can go through and choose these, even if you're not sure. You can pick one of those. If you know what it is, you can just go ahead and start typing it and it'll pop up in there. And then once you post your observations, if you look on the left over here, this auto-filled itself. So it used the information from my phone and filled it in. And you can also put notes like descriptions and things like that. So there's lots of information you can add to it if you wanted to. And then on your telephone, this is typically how you would go ahead and use it if you're here. So you would just take a photo, snap a photo. There's a lot of buttons, especially this is a smartphone, you have some kind of button to hit it, and these are your options, so record or something like that. On this is an Android, but typically once you get your photo in here, you can click over here what you saw. And one of the nicest things is when it pulls it up on your telephone, it has an ability then to compare your picture, which is kind of neat, to a professional picture and compare them back and forth. And so, for example, I'm going to jump here. Here it is. You can hit this little cool button, and it is kind of neat because you can compare it. So here's my photo, and you can like toggle through all the photos of this plant, whether it be the flower or the leaf and something like that, and compare it to your photo and see and read a description. This was a Dutchman britches that I took a picture of my garden. And so it helps you identify it down. You can then go to the next one and go, nope, that's not it. And then you just hit plus if you think that's what it is. Makes it pretty easy. And once it's uploaded, you'll just have a long running list of all your photos. It is easier to look at all your observations on a computer than your telephone, but you can look at a map of all your observations. Now on a iPhone is pretty similar. And you take a look here. This is similar. This is a screenshots, but it shows you it's pretty similar. On the bottom is where all your buttons are for adding photos or recording. The newest feature now within last year, they added finally recording sound. So both an iPhone and an Android can record sounds as well as photos, which makes it great for this project. And I'll explain what project I have on here. So if you get enough observations on a naturalist, you can start your own project. And so one of the projects I started along with FrogWatch is to try to build an auditory library that people could utilize and go back. And so we're asking people we do use pictures, but if you put an audio, I can actually download your audio and I can graph it out to make sure what species it is if I'm not sure. And so it allows to build a really good record of our frogs and toads, and without a recording device to a tree, because people are out there with their recording devices. And so all of our audio and pictures, I have 2 projects on there. And so if you happen to be outside, you take a photo at a park or a recording at a park, one of them is called Frog Call STL. And if you go on iNaturalist and there's a little tab that says projects, you can type in Frog Call STL and you'll see all the observations that are part of that project. And if you happen to make one that's in my area, and my area being the Missouri and STL metro area that I set up for the project, it'll automatically, unless you put it as private, your observations automatically dump into these projects. And I have one that's frogs and toads in Missouri, which we have lots of pictures in there. And so what I'm looking for, and the way I set my project up, is called research grade. And so actually you take an observation and you identify it using the AI, and then somebody comes along and identifies it. You have to have at least 3 people agreeing on your species identification. When you do that, they mark it as research grade. And my projects pull all the research grades into there. And so what usually it would be a good photo or something like that is easy to identify them. And the reason why we do it that way is for some type of verification. I want to make sure it's as close, to an accurate as possible. And then these projects are actually supporting 2 things. So number one, this is helping the greater St. Louis FrogWatch chapter because it's building maps that we're using to show where stuff is. And I have another project that came out of FrogWatch, and it's called the Spring Peeper program. And so that program is where I'm out using audio devices. And so one of the things we're using audio devices, and we're also using iNaturalist data, research iNaturalist data that's auditory to actually confirm where some of these species are. And this is what's actually helped show me where these species really are. A lot of times we have people saying they're not here, but now we have pretty good proof that they are. Unfortunately, the spring peeper, chorus frog, and cricket frog are slowly disappearing out of that metro area. Now, the spring peeper program has some bigger goals to try to get them back, but the first thing we need to know is where they were. So some quick do's and don'ts of iNaturalist. They do recommend, if you've never used it before, when you first set up your thing, do take some test photos, and you can delete them. Only you have the power to go in and actually delete your photos. So take some test photos. We usually recommend, if you're just like taking some photos just for testing, write the word test on them so somebody doesn't go and try to identify them. And then go back later and delete them. And it's not that hard to delete. We ask, do photograph weeds. We might call it a weed, but it's actually good because whether it's invasive or not, it's good to know where they are. They're a plant. We want to know where some of those things are. If you photograph something in your garden that you planted, there is a little tab you can click and hit captive or cultivated. Now, some things they recommend you don't do for lots of reasons. Don't photograph houseplants. We don't need pictures of houseplants. Don't photograph faces because you're breaking, especially if you happen to be a child, you're breaking different rules and laws. Typically, it'll be flagged and deleted by the iNaturalist platform if they didn't catch it right away. But typically, they're pretty fast. But don't take pictures of anybody's faces. And then the last one is don't upload other people's photos. Don't take a photo, like if you missed it and you got away, but you're like, I know I saw this species. Don't go online and download that animal and upload it because you're breaking a copyright law. It does have some built-in features. Sometimes I might recognize that. Now, going back to the faces, hands don't matter. I don't know how his script was written, but it doesn't recognize hands, so it uses as a part of the background. So if you have a frog in your hand, it won't recognize it as a human. It'll recognize the thing that's on your hand. So some additional ways that you can get involved if you have an interest, even after you start taking photos. But if you wanted to monitor a site, get more involved, we do have a FrogWatch training if you happen to be interested, one coming up on March 29th at 7 p.m. And that one will be virtual. And then we do have an in-person FrogWatch training that will be at the St. Louis Zoo, and that's April 5th. And these are all on our website. But if you have an interest, and the difference is there's a lot more commitment or involvement in those where you might monitor a site, whether it be a zoo site or register your own, and you monitor the same site, hopefully multiple times, so we can collect some phenology data, the timing of when these guys are calling. But any type of involvement, whether or not you just happen to be at a park and take a photo, it helps a lot because it puts another dot on the map and helps us know what's happening to our frog populations. Some good resources. We do have our own website, and it's open to anybody. And so it's not too hard to forget. It's www.frogwatchstl.com. And right now it does come up pretty often when you're on different platforms, whether it be Google or another search engine. But it does have a lot of areas where you have additional resources where you can listen to frog calls. You can practice frog calls. There is information for if you happen to be a volunteer or something like that and you get involved. But even all the other maps, what's going on, where to find frogs, like what parks you can go to, lots of good information on there. So, feel free to check out our website, and hopefully you'll find it useful. And I think in one place there's a form if you think of other things that could be useful on our website. We're always looking for suggestions and things like that. This is a website that I built, and definitely could, if anybody has good suggestions, I'm always open to try to make it more useful and helpful for people. So I think that is it. So I'm going to once again open up if anybody has any questions you'd like to ask about this program or anything you'd like to know. So the question is, can my FrogWatch site be anywhere in Missouri? And yes, right now and you could tie it to the closest chapter, but it can be anywhere in Missouri. It can be anywhere in Illinois. There are only so many chapters, so it's whatever chapter is closest to you. But the general answer is yes, it can be anywhere. I shouldn't say every state. I'm involved at the top level, but most states have FrogWatch chapters, and so we may be the closest to you, but may not. If you're not sure if there's any closer one, let me know what area you might be in, or at least setting up a site, and I could let you know. Great question. I was going to mention that we do have some opportunities coming up. They have not been posted, so I'm not going to give you dates yet. But if you're interested in some frog walks on the zoo's website, under where you probably found the registration for this, we are going to start putting up some dates. And so if you're interested, and I'll be at most of those, but we'll go out for walks and practice our frog calls and hopefully see some neat frogs up close. And so there'll be different places around the city. So we're trying to come up with some neat events for people. I know for certain that Shaw Nature Preserve always offers, I think, a spring peeper walk at their place. And I don't know if they have theirs posted yet, but if I see it, I'll put it on our website too. But there's great opportunities hopefully coming up this spring now that we're getting out, hopefully away from COVID, and get people back outside in groups and going looking for frogs and toads. So hopefully it'll be a great year. So that's all I have for tonight. I wanted to thank everybody for coming. If you have any other questions that didn't come up or something you wanted to ask, feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to try to answer if I can. At the zoo, it's pretty easy. My last name's Dawson, so it's DAWSON at stlzoo.org. And you are welcome to send frog questions, and I will do my best to try to answer them. So with that, I am going to say, I hope everybody has a great evening, and maybe you'll hear some frogs tonight, because I hear them actually outside my house. So hopefully you guys might, wherever you'll be living, might be hearing something out there tonight. And I wish everybody the best, and thank you for attending tonight.